Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Welcome to the 6th week of Capital Outlook on Wyoming PBS. I'm Craig Blumenshine. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, this show is packed full. We'll begin with a discussion with two members of the Conference Committee and also members of the Joint Appropriations Committee. That's Senator Dave Kinskey and Representative Lloyd Larsen. The group tells us how a compromise has been reached with the supplemental budget bill here in the Wyoming legislature. Capital construction projects are still out there, and they'll talk about those potentially as well. Then we'll have a profile with the longest-serving Democrat in the Wyoming House. That's Representative Stan Blake from Green River. He'll sing his way through this week's Capital Outlook profile. Then we'll have our weekly discussion with the leadership of the Wyoming legislature. That's Senate President Drew Perkins and Speaker of the House Steve Harshman. We'll talk with President Perkins about allegations that surfaced on February 4th in a letter to him from Wyoming Equality regarding interactions with Cheyenne Central High School students and Senator Lynn Hutchings. The President will update us on what's happening with an investigation and a potential timeline for resolution. We'll continue to meet freshmen here in the Wyoming legislature, kind of, this week. Representative Jim Roscoe, who had served previously in the Wyoming House of Representatives, is back. He's also the only independent currently serving in the Wyoming legislature. We'll also meet new Senator Tom James. Finally, we'll end with a discussion of what time it may be in Wyoming. That's with Representative Larsen and his bill, which in effect would move Wyoming to daylight savings time year-round. All that's on Capital Outlook, starting now.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
Welcome to Week 6 of Capital Outlook here on Wyoming PBS. You're looking at a picture of two Wyoming senators, Senator Cale Case and Senator Michael Von Flatern. They have their baseball gloves in their hand, which means maybe three things. That spring's coming, the legislature's in the home stretch, and baseball season's not far away. Not a bad thing for this reporter. But we want to begin our discussion with two members of the Joint Appropriations Committee and also the Budget Conference Committee, the Supplemental Budget Conference Committee. That's Representative Lloyd Larsen and Senator Dave Kinskey. Thank you very much for joining us on Capital Outlook today.
Thanks for having us.
Both of you are members of the Joint Appropriations Committee. I think a lot has happened in the last week, to say the least, with your committee. Senator Kinskey, a week ago, you were, I think, somewhat pessimistic on whether this body would have a supplemental budget. It now does. How did we get there?
Well, we got high-centered on a few things, but this budget process is one of just constant winnowing, where you just knock a few of the easy things off, and then you start gnawing away on some of the harder things until you get down to that last half dozen. And if everybody's in the mood to compromise and do the right thing, then you can get big things done, and we got a budget done. Yeah,
and Senator, let me ask you, before we allow the representative to chime in, a week ago you weren't there. In fact, on a local interview on a local radio station, you said that with each passing day you were less hopeful that there would be a compromise and that we might walk away from Cheyenne without a supplemental budget bill, but that wouldn't be the end of the world. What's changed? Well,
hope springs eternal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it is true that this is just a supplemental budget. It's not the budget for the 2-year budget cycle. We're in between the beginning of that 2-year cycle and the end, and at that midway point, you're supposed to be just doing emergency adjustments. And we were getting high-centered on some things that really were not emergencies.
And what were those in your mind?
Well, it's just, the Senate is just a tad bit more conservative than the House side, I think, and there was some spending there that we found objectionable, but in the end, it all got worked out.
Education to me seemed like it was a big hurdle. Representative, how did this process come about?
Well, I've sat in a couple of these now, and it's been my experience that you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And we know these guys on the Senate side. We work with them all year long. There's no effort on the House side or the Senate side to walk away from the process with something undone. I just had full confidence that we would get a supplemental budget. How it would look remained unseen, but last night we put the final stitch in it and nailed the lid on, and we're waiting for a conference report.
A couple of the big issues were the external cost adjustment for teachers. The Senate wanted less, the House wanted more. Where did that end up, Senator?
We ended up where the House wanted.
Okay.
We ended up at where the Joint Education Committee recommended, at $18 million cost adjustment.
Which was the governor's initial recommendation, if I recall.
There were some other, there were a large number of issues that ultimately we got resolved, and once we got some of the others out of the way, the education cost adjustment came kind of easy.
You had agreed prior to a 2% raise for state employees and community college workers. Did that make it through?
It did. It did. It's we've done some tweaking there. There's concerns about if you have employees, state employees that have a higher salary, such as over $80,000 a year, a larger portion of that appropriation would go to meet their 2%. So we worked out a deal to where everything would be based on those upper salaries, capped at $80,000, and that spread more of that money for raises around to all state employees. I thought that was a great idea and seemed to fit. In
reporting by Andrew Graham with Wildfile this week, he interviewed the governor, and the governor said essentially that Wyoming citizens want more out of their lawmakers than Senate leadership suggestion that the supplemental budget could fail. He suggesting that the bodies need to work together and not clash to move the state forward. Did that have any influence on how this budget compromise came about, Senator?
There's just genuine disagreement. The more I see of this process, the more I believe in the wisdom of the founders of this great country. You have two legislative bodies, and they come to the table very often with two different perspectives. And out of that debate and that discussion, you get what you hope in the end is a pretty good product and some compromise.
The governor, in his wisdom, has stayed clear of this process, as he should, until at the end when we have, we wind up in conference committees on stuff. Sometimes we use his expertise. We did with Governor Meade from time to time. Governor Gordon's been very thoughtful and very strategic on his comments in this process, and I appreciate that. We work every day together with the Senate on working this through. Every day you saw little changes, and that's the process. And we can growl and snort and paw the ground during that whole process, but every day something got done.
In the discussion on compromise, I have to ask about the capital construction bill. That's a bill that came out of your committee with an agreement that then turned to a 30-0 vote against, and I'm talking about Senate File 162 in the Senate. What happened there, and what's the status of capital construction projects as we move forward, speaking here on Wednesday morning?
Well, what happened with the 30-0 vote in the Senate? Well, everybody's motivations are different. I know mine. I was concerned there was just too much unnecessary spending in it. And we are looking at, in the next 2 years, a $350 million educational deficit. And then 2 years after that, $500 million. So the sentiment of many on the Senate side is if we are going to have any capital construction, it should just be the absolute gotta-haves, that there should not be ornamentation on the Christmas tree. And the sentiment started out against that CapCon bill from day one in the Senate, because it's just so much spending, and everybody is so worried about where we're heading with this educational deficit that the bias is, let's save the money. Let's save the money and see what we've got to do, the tough decisions that we've got to make sure that education stays whole. And that killing the capital construction bill it's a tough decision. And I don't know if it'll come back or not. We'll see.
Representative, it left the Joint Appropriations Committee moving forward in the process, and then that happened.
It did. It was an interesting process going through, because that whole budget process, you look at your capital construction, then you look at your budget bill, and they're kind of moved through the process a little bit at the same time. We were getting hung up as a body a little bit with both of them simultaneously. The good chairman of the Senate Appropriations called time out, so to speak, and says, listen, let's get a CapCon bill, something that we can all agree on. And let's move it out. Then we'll come back and work through these more significant challenges that we have in our budget bill. we thought that that was great wisdom. And so we went through the Capcom bill, we pulled stuff out, we done that. And then that was passed out of JEC as a bill that we all felt comfortable with that went to the Senate. So I think that the House feels that there should be a capital construction bill coming forward, and I'm comfortable that it will. I guess I would say to Senator Kinskey, whom I have great respect for, that coming out of the vote in the Senate, that I would have, if it was lost, I would have thought there would have been 5 votes for it, because those were the 5 votes for it in the House or in the Joint Appropriations Committee meeting. It didn't. It's okay. And again, if nothing comes forward, which I believe it will, and I have no little birds on the wall or anything to suggest that I know anything. I just have faith in my colleagues across the aisle.
Senator Kinskey, you were a positive vote in joint appropriations, and that turned the corner. Respond.
I hope his faith is well placed.
It is. It is. These are good guys.
So what is that process, Senator? You support in committee?
The Senate is a deliberative body, and you can feel one way in a small subset in a committee, and you get out on the floor and you start listening to your colleagues, and it can change minds pretty quickly. And on balance, I think that there's some merit to what Representative Larsen says, that we had this Capcom bill and we had this budget bill, and to say, look, we're just going to set this Capcom aside. Let's see if we can get a budget first. I think that's exactly right. I think setting the Capcom aside helped in terms of the budget. Otherwise, we were just trying to get too much done with too many dollars all at once. So we may or may not revisit the Capcom. Stay tuned. We still have time.
There is time remaining. Let's turn the page to something you talked about earlier, education. Andrew Graham also reported that the governor has called for lawmakers to act on education funding, and I quote, with some consequence, unquote, in this session. How's that process moving forward, and what could that consequence with some consequence be? Either one. Have you?
I think that's one area that I think the Senate has been our conscience on the consequence side. That as we move forward, that there's only so many dollars in the pot, and you have to appropriate those wisely, and they can't be squandered. And so the discussion on education, how that should be funded, where it should go, is a very deliberate back and forth discussion between the Senate and the House. And I think the budget bill reflects that significantly.
I think there was some discussion in the context of the article about the National Retail Fairness Act and whether or not that, as some have labeled, a corporate income tax, should move forward. It's going to be heard in Senate corporations, I think, on Thursday afternoon. We're filming this Wednesday. Senator, what are your thoughts on a potential $45 million additional dollars that is currently earmarked for education, whether A, you support that bill, or B, whether it should go to the general fund or to education?
Well, I have real strong feelings about raising taxes and new taxes, and I've got particularly strong feelings about income taxes. I'm against income taxes, whether it's corporate or personal. So look, the idea of the bill is they're calling it the big box bill. And the intention is just to hit the big box retailers. So you've got an income tax that gives you credit for all the other taxes you pay. And the argument being these retailers don't pay a whole lot of other taxes, which I believe is true. And so they won't get much credit. Other corporations that pay ad valorem taxes and so forth, they won't have any liability. But the key is that in that bill you're saying, here's the NAICS codes, that is the codes that say retail sector. That's the only codes that are in there. But the next session, all it takes is a bill to add this code and this code and this code and this code, and then you're on a slippery slope to adding a personal income tax. And you hear in the debate that there's just going to be this small percentage of taxpayers that pay it. That's how the U.S. income tax started out. It started out as it was just going to be 1% on the top 1%. Nobody else would ever pay an income tax. And now look where we are. Everybody's subject to the income tax. So the other thing on taxes is, once you start raising taxes, I think you feed a false narrative that we've done everything we can to control spending. and we're a long ways from that. We got a long way to go to say that we've really done everything we can to control spending in Cheyenne.
Representative?
So the thing that I like about the National Fairness Act, House Bill 220, is that these large retailers are indeed paying taxes. They're just paying them off the revenues they generate in Wyoming. They're paying in their home state, whether that be Arkansas or someplace else. So why don't we collect that revenue off what they make in Wyoming? They will still receive credit for it in their home state. It makes sense to me to do that. I think that somehow we have to unhook some of the sledge from the one horse that's been pulling them all along, which is your extractive industries. We cannot continue to move forward depending on extraction to pay all the bills. And with that, do we need to cut some of our expenditures? Absolutely. Do we need to be fiscally responsible? Absolutely. But do other industries need to step up to the plate? Absolutely. I certainly believe they do. And when so I'm not in favor of an income tax. I'm not, but we can't stick our head in the sand, so to speak, and say that it's okay because the extractive industries are going to continue to pay for everything. Now, should it go to education? You know, we have those two distinct budgets, but I think you see them creep just a little bit closer every year. There's a lot of, a lot of that extra money comes into the LSRA, our savings account, and we've been taking care of the shortfalls to education from that account. We've seen efforts this year and a lot of discussion that's take any of this extra revenue to cover the shortfall. We'll put it in the LSRA, and as we need it, we'll pay for it. So, I'm okay either way.
It's still the case that the LSRA, after you have done your work last night, will grow.
It will.
I want to conclude the interview with something else the governor had talked about in his interview on Wildfire with Andrew Graham, and that was, let's have full funding for tribal liaisons. And I ask you, Representative, because you represent part of Fremont County that's very close, and you have done a lot of work with both the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho tribes. What are your thoughts today on whether that should be part of this process going forward again?
Well, it was part of this process in the supplemental budget. We opened up the governor's office. I made that request to fund the tribal liaison again, and fortunately, my colleagues on the Senate side and the House side agreed to do that this supplemental session as one-time funding to once again evaluate the work that the liaisons do and the overall benefit, if any, to the state government and the relationship between that and the tribes. And then the governor, after we reevaluate that, can make that case to put that back in his standard budget.
I've said before, I think few people realize how hard and how much time and commitment it takes to be a member of the Joint Appropriations Committee. And I appreciate the work that both of you do. So I appreciate also you taking time this morning to join us on Capitol
Well,
Outlook.
we think Wyoming's worth it.
It sure is.
It's a wonderful state. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We now turn to a Capitol Outlook profile, a very popular segment in our Capitol Outlook shows, this time with the longest serving Democrat in the Wyoming House, and that, of course, is Democrat Stan Blake. He'll sing his way through this Capitol Outlook profile. Stay with us. And it's our privilege now and pleasure to be joined by Stan Blake. Representative Blake, welcome to this Capitol Outlook profile. We're here in Green River at
Great to be on here, and welcome to Green River.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're at the Green River Center of Western Wyoming College.
Yes.
And I think when some people think of Wyoming community colleges, they remember that there are 7 community colleges and Gillette College, but they may forget there are many centers in Wyoming.
Yeah, that's true, and this is a great facility up here, and I thought it'd be good to have our meeting up here, so
yeah,
thanks for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our pleasure to be here. You are the longest serving Democrat in the House and the 4th longest serving legislator in the House.
Well, you put it that way, it's, yeah, time flies when you're having fun, I guess, but I enjoy having that moniker to myself. But
Let's just start by, why did you run initially?
you know, it all actually kind of started. My dad was a teacher in Evanston for years. And one of his courses that he taught, classes that he taught, was American Civics. And which they probably don't even teach anymore that I know of. But so that instilled upon me that you should, you know, do public service. And when I hired out on the railroad here, I joined my union, and I became the legislative representative for the local here in Green River. And I was at a meeting in Casper, and I think it was the Equality State Policy Center, and they were talking about there's going to be a seat open up in Green River. Who do we know that lives in Green River? And I was literally looking at the ceiling tiles, and they asked me, so where do you live, Stan? And I go, I live in Green River, 460 West Railroad. And they go, that's in your district, you should think about it. So I did. I thought about my dad, and I talked to my wife, and she says, let's do it. So I decided to run and try to make a difference.
There aren't many Democrats in the House. Why is that? Why do you think there aren't as many Democrats in Wyoming's legislature compared to other states?
Well, I think Wyoming Democrats are connected unfairly, I think, to the National Democratic Party, because we are not the National Democratic Party. We represent people in Wyoming. You know, we're totally different.
Different as in more moderate, or is that the difference?
I think we're way more moderate. In Wyoming Democrats know what pays the bills here: oil and gas, coal. And not saying we don't need to diversify that, but we realize what's going on. My constituents love to hunt, love to fish. They love their guns, and I realize that. And I think we get a bad rap from the National Party here in Wyoming. So,
do you think Wyomingites would be surprised that you have an A rating from the NRA?
I had fellow legislators tell me that they were very surprised. But I do have an A rating from the NRA. I voted positively on almost every gun bill that comes before the House and the legislature.
You work for the railroad. You're a switchman.
Yes.
What's a switchman?
A switchman? Well, we receive trains in the Green River Yard, and then I quantify it as like resort mail. So we'll pull a cut of railroad cars out with our locomotive, and then I will switch the cars out into different rails, different destinations, and then we make a train or two a day, and then they leave town and we start all over again. And so just switching railroad cars.
So I bet you see some fairly cool graffiti.
I see all kinds of graffiti, Craig, and some is astonishing. I post some of it on my social media pages. Some of the artwork is unbelievable, beautiful, and others is questionable.
You're a car guy.
Oh yeah,
love muscle cars. How did that?
I love muscle cars.
How did that start?
Well, I think it goes back to my family. My dad always took care of his cars. He had an old '66 Impala, which I wish I still had today, but I don't. And I still have his 1974 International Scout. And I just love to tinker. When I retire, I'm going to be in the garage. My wife will have to come ring the dinner bell when it's time to come in, because I'm going to work on my cars.
You go to a car show almost every year.
I'm a member of the SEMA caucus, and
what is the SEMA caucus?
It's the Specialty Equipment Manufacturers Association, and it's a caucus of like-minded legislatures, Democrats, Republicans, federal, state. There's like 750 state legislators who are in this caucus. But we go to the SEMA show in Las Vegas, and there's all kinds of celebrities there, cars, new products. So it's a great time, but wear some comfortable shoes, I'll say that.
So you grew up in Evanston?
That's true.
Born in Colorado, moved to Evanston when you were very young. And then from Evanston, where did you go?
I lived in Evanston for 20-some years, and I moved to Cheyenne to become an iron worker. And actually, I worked on some PBS towers up on Limestone.
So you're one of those guys who didn't mind climbing way up there?
I used to climb gigantic towers, broadcast antennas, television.
And that was all over the region or all over the country?
All over the country. We've worked all over the place, from Alabama to Washington State. So we worked a lot of places.
Tallest tower you were on?
Hemingford, Nebraska, for Nebraska Public Television. I think it was 2,000 feet. So,
Is that an elevator partway up and you're
It's
climbing the rest?
1,500 feet up in an elevator, and then you climb the last 500 feet just to change a light bulb. So, yeah, it's an expensive light bulb, to say the least.
What was that like looking down? I mean, obviously you could handle heights.
Heights never bothered me, and the people in the cars look like ants on the ground. So, yeah, and when you drop a wrench from up there, it's
trouble.
You say, "Look out below."
I hope they hear you.
And then from there, I hired on with the railroad in Green River, and I've always loved Southwest Wyoming, being raised in Uena County, and we're kind of that Southwest Wyoming corner here. And so I hired out with them in Green River, and been there 28 years.
For those of us who watch the legislature every day, we watch you say the pledge.
Correct.
And then we hear this play ball, and that's coming from you. How did that come about?
Wow. I picked it up from Representative Illoway. Pete Illoway, Cheyenne, used to do it. And when he didn't run again, he kind of said, "You sit up there in the corner of the Capitol. Be great if you could do that." And I thought, I'm an outgoing guy. I thought that would be great. So, and I believe somebody did it before him. I'm not sure who, but yeah, special occasions during the swearing in and stuff, the speaker comes and says, "We don't need play ball today, Stan." So yeah.
It's an interesting metaphor for what happens in the House, though,
That's right.
I mean, guys,
and in the House, after I say play ball, we say our pledge, our prayer, we go greet each other. How's the family? How's your wife? How's your kids? So we have like 5-10 minutes where we just talk to each other. And then we get down to the business of the state of Wyoming.
You've contemplated, I'm sure, Wyoming's future like many of your colleagues have. What is Wyoming going to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? Obviously, the governor Governor Meade had the Endow Initiative.
Correct.
To economically diversify Wyoming. What's your vision of Wyoming 15 years down the road or so?
Well, I want to keep Wyoming a great place to live in for our kids. I want to keep our public lands available for everybody, not just the few. But we have to diversify our economy. Now, a lot of people have different opinions.
Now, what does that mean to you, Representative?
To me, here in Southwest Wyoming, to diversify our economy here, we have soda ash, or trona. There's 4 mines right around here that run the economy of Southwest Wyoming. And that's used in making glass, detergent, fertilizers, everything you could imagine has soda ash in it. We have abundance of water, we have great power, we have coal. I would look at a facility here to become a manufacturing facility. Why do we ship soda ash to make glass when we can make that glass here? And it would be a huge investment by the counties, the state. But I look at that, we need to look at wind, solar, all kinds of different things. But a manufacturing facility in Southwest Wyoming would be fantastic.
I've been told you can sing. And I've been told that you kind of carry the weight of the House on your shoulders in certain competitions each year. Is that an accurate statement?
That is true. We have a House versus Senate karaoke smackdown, I call it. And the House did pretty good the first couple of years, but we've lost 3 years in a row. But this is the year we're going to come back. I've already got some songs on my phone here that I'm working on. So the House is going to take that trophy back, I'm afraid, this year.
You were telling me about some years ago in the Capitol and there are times at the end of the session when you're not as busy as you are at the start of the session. You might be waiting for something to come over from the Senate, and there's some idle time at the very end. There used to be music on the House floor.
We used to, Representative Barbudo, when he was there, would set up a piano or electric organ. We would sing. Bill Thompson, who recently passed away here from Green River, would play his banjo. I did a medley of all the service, Marine Corps hymn, Navy hymn, Army, Air Force. we sang all those. It was a good time. John Patton, who passed away, he had a song that I still have a copy of, and we used to sing that. And you know, singing opens up your soul and drops all barriers, and you can have some real camaraderie singing. But it was fantastic, and we've kind of gotten away from that. And but I think that's a good way to open up the new Capitol. Would be a great music thing there.
That's coming upon us here. We'll have to see if something that bears out. Your go-to karaoke song is?
Probably Stormy by the Classics 4.
Okay.
Yeah, I love that
Give me a few bars here.
Yesterday's love was like a warm summer breeze, but like the weather you've changed.
Awesome.
Good enough?
Perfect. Representative Blake, this has been a wonderful Capital Outlook profile. We look forward to seeing you more in the session. And congratulations on your re-election.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep. And we continue on here in week 6 with our weekly discussion with the leadership of the Wyoming Legislature, Senate President Drew Perkins and Speaker of the House Steve Harshman. Welcome again to you both.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Lots going on this week, but I would be remiss, Mr. President, and I want to begin with you with some issues surrounding allegations against Senator Lynn Hutchins and a letter that you received from a group called Wyoming Equality on February 4th that outlined some communications between Senator Hutchins and 10 high school students from here in Cheyenne that were in the halls. They were here lobbying for a bill, and there were some allegations that there were some sexually explicit language may be exchanged and some comparisons of homosexuality with pedophilia and bestiality. Allegations that Senator Hutchins has since denied. We've invited her several times to appear with us on our show. She's chosen not to come. But Mr. President, you received that letter on February 4th. What's happened since?
The first thing that happens when someone files a complaint is that it comes back and we do an investigation. We have LSO attorneys. The complaint itself is filed with...
And the LSO is the Legislative Service Office here that is your staff.
That's correct. They're our nonpartisan professional service office. And so the LSO director is also an attorney, Matt Obrecht, and so the complaint goes to Matt Obrecht, and he is the person to whom all complaints are funneled, of course, unless the complaint was against him. They also typically, want to know whether it's an informal or a formal complaint that they're filing, and also they visit with them about what resolutions or what type of things would they feel would resolve the matter. And so that's the process that it goes through. Once they get to that point, then they come and they'll visit. If it's a senator, they visit with me as the Senate President. If it was a House member, they'd visit with Speaker Harshman. And we kind of sit down and go through the process, unless they've asked us not to. And then with their permission, if they give you permission, you would sit down and share the actual complaint document with whoever's been complained against. In this case, say if it was a senator, sit down with the senator, they get to view the complaint, and then they get to respond. If there was action to be taken, it would be referred on generally to the process required, go to the subcommittee of the Management Council. They would look at that. They might hold a hearing. They might give people an opportunity to come and speak. Those hearings are held under an executive session. The entire process is confidential. If they thought that there was action should be taken, then the only people that can discipline senator is the full body of the Senate. My understanding is that the confirmation we had with the Wyoming Equality people was, at this point, it's an informal complaint.
Okay. I should point out the Cheyenne students have asked for a clear and direct apology in the letter to you and clarification that Senator Hutchins' behavior was unacceptable and inappropriate as an elected official. So just briefly, in this timeline, when might the public understand whether there's some sort of resolution, or will the public ever understand?
I think that they may. We have been in. I've even visited everybody. I think we have an inquiry out to the Wyoming Equality people who made the complaint. When I checked yesterday, we hadn't heard back from them. So until or unless we get some kind of basically permission from them, if they give us permission, then we might be able to share something. If they don't, then we won't be able to share what we're doing.
All right. Thank you for the update. We appreciate that. On to some accomplishments, if you will, some good news coming out of the legislature this week. In my eyes, the supplemental budget agreement has been reached. We've talked about it earlier in the show. What are your reflections now on that process, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I think
you know, it's one of the smaller supplemental budgets we've had in many, many years. I think really appreciate the work of the members on both the Senate and the House. Worked very hard, worked for months, you know, putting this together and taking all the testimony from agencies and then bringing it all to the finish. It's a rightfully tough process, and I appreciate all their work and their passion to do that. And I appreciate the leadership of Senator Perkins as well, and working with him. And so I think we've got a very good budget going forward. Obviously, it's always balanced, and we always pay our bills in Wyoming, and I think there's several little things that are gonna, you know, that we're gonna take care of until we come back here next time.
Is it exactly the budget the Senate would have put out? No. Is it exactly the budget the House would put out? No. But quite frankly, in the legislature, compromise is not a dirty word. It's not a bad word.
Where are we at with capital construction? We had Senator Kinskey and Representative Larsen on earlier in the show, maybe at odds on whether or not there would be a capital construction piece moving through. Mr. Speaker, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think, you know, we're waiting for the Senate to bring it our way. I think we could send one their way, but I think, again, about the process, it's their bill right now, and I think they'll send it our way. There's a lot of, it's about 90 million in construction, most of it spread around the corners of our state, community colleges, some work that needs to be done at the training school in Lander, certainly. And
it appears that we can do one of two things. The old school way is that you would suspend your rules. That takes a 2/3 majority vote to suspend your rules and bring it back. So that's an option. But then our friends in the House taught us a new thing about rescinding a prior action this year, which is another way that you could approach it as well, which is available through Masons, and nothing in our rules would preclude that. So there's a couple of options that the bill has an opportunity.
Are you advocating for either?
We'll bring it up to our members and see what they want to do.
An emotional bill went forward in committee last night and will be heading to the floor of the Senate. And I'm speaking of the bill that will eliminate capital punishment and replace it with a natural life sentence. Highly emotional, highly charged, passed the House. Mr. Speaker, let me start with you. Your thoughts on that bill, and then we'll talk to the President about it.
Yeah, I think, you know, I co-sponsored that bill this year. I think you're always conflicted. You know, I've always I think I've told folks I'm probably the most pro-life speaker in the history of Wyoming. I think, but we have that, you know, you put yourself in the victim's shoes and you run all those scenarios in your head. But in the end, I guess too, my really response really as a person on the budget, we're spending a lot of money each year for nothing. And we're not, if we were gonna really, you know, ramp up the death penalty and be a state like Texas, we're gonna have to spend probably 5 times the money we're spending. We're spending $750 to $1 million each year just to have that law on the books. And so I think at some point you gotta say, what's the role of the state? And it's not easy. Those are one of those, you sit in your chair and there's a vote's being called. So it was very emotional, 3-hour debate in the House, tears flowing down members' cheeks. It's passed on to the Senate, and they'll experience that same thing. And
Mr. President, it is coming your way. I'm sure it'll be debated on the Senate floor now. What are you thinking as this bill comes at you?
Well, actually, Speaker and I served on appropriations, on General Appropriations Committee during our time on there, overlapped with each other. And, you know, people have great emotional things about that. There are both sides. There are winning arguments on both sides of that issue. Retribution and danger and all those things that come from the victim side. The other side is, you know, is it a perfect system? I mean, you have the advocacy groups where people have been exonerated from crimes that were on death that they were scheduled to be executed for. So we're humans, so we don't have a perfect system. So we understand that, but as an appropriator, you know, I would probably generally continue to support the death penalty, but quite frankly, it's more cost effective for the state to clothe and feed these individuals for the rest of their lives than it is to execute them. It is such an absolute expensive process to do it. We have the ability to we can convert them and to life without parole. and keep them incarcerated so that they're never a danger to anyone else again, and to do it more cost effectively than actually enforcing the death penalty.
Speaking of process, have you started the process to really think about interim topics? Is that an ongoing thing for you? And has that process of you announcing your interim topics changed in the last year or two?
Yes.
Well, I think yes, it has, to answer your question. And so those are kind of boiling up through public comment and through the committees themselves. You can go on our website, make recommendations, those kind of things. And then we'll actually come back in a couple weeks after we adjourn and everybody's had a chance to kind of take a breath, and we'll come back for more chairman training, and we're incorporating more of that, and then presentation of those interim topics to Management Council. I think that's on the 20th, 21st of March.
It'd be very interesting to see what the interim, it always is, what the interim priorities become. Mr. President, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for joining us here on Capital Outlook again.
Thank you, Craig.
And as we continue on with Capital Outlook here in week 6, we're pleased to be joined by two freshman legislators, kind of. Senator Tom James hails from Rock Springs, and Representative Jim Roscoe hails from Wilson. To you both, welcome.
Thank you.
And I say kind of, Representative, because you were in the legislature a few years ago for 2 terms, took some time off, and now you're back. Why did you want to run again?
I had a little pressure from my neighbors and my 2 sons, and I felt that after I left, we had gone through a budget downturn, and we cut about between $300 and $400 million out of the budget, and then it seemed like there was still cuts going on, and education was suffering, and that became a big focus for me. I don't think that we need to cut education anymore, and I think we need to find some funding for it. And I think there are funding out there. We just have to do it. I guess we have to.
Representative Roscoe, it's interesting to me that you are the only independent in the Wyoming legislature. You've been asked to caucus by the Democrats. You've been asked to caucus with the Republicans, and you've chosen not to. Why are you an independent? And what does that mean?
Well, it's just the way I felt, and I just didn't want to be put in a box either way. And it seems to me when you're in a box on one side or the other that you just lose contact with your constituents. And they assume that you're a certain way when you're not. And I also found that that's just the way I felt, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I would go on both sides of the aisle quite often. So
when you served previously?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure if I was going to be left out in the cold or be able to get information from both sides and have conversations. And I have friends on both sides, so it just seemed to work. And I think that is happening. I feel really comfortable. And I like the caucuses on Wednesday. No one is in the House at all.
Do you have your own caucus, and do you lose every vote or do you win every vote? How does that work?
We have a great conversation.
There you go. Senator James, one of the things that you ran on was this concept of transparency.
Yes.
And I want to talk with you about that first. Yeah. You maintain a manual spreadsheet that is fascinating to me. You update it as often as you can, and you can look at every senator or representative's vote on every vote they've taken here since the session started. And you put a lot of effort into that.
That's correct, yeah. On my website, I have a spreadsheet that has one page is how I voted on each bill and an explanation in there of why I voted that way. On another one is all the Senate, the way they voted. These are all recorded votes that are already on the legislative website. And so I just catalog it, make sure it's all in one spot, so that way when people want to get a good idea of how they're being represented, they can see it all in one place instead of having to go to that website and go to each individual page for all the amendments for each bill. It just makes it a lot easier for them and giving them transparency that I promised.
The question becomes, when do you sleep? That's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. When I do it on the weekends, it takes about 20 to 30 hours over the weekend to do it. And then I do a little bit of updating during the week as well.
And is that the primary reason that you ran for the transparency issue?
The transparency, yes, and I'm pretty fiscally conservative, and I follow a very strict budget in my own household, and I'm trying to get it in place within the legislature to follow that, to get them out of the mindset of the use it or lose it mentality, to get them to think of the people's money as if it was coming out of their own pocket. I feel that if they had that mindset, they would spend it a lot more responsibly. They would not spend money when we have none.
You both are you've seen your first supplemental budget here in this session. We understand there's maybe an agreement about that budget. We've talked about that earlier in the program today. But out there still is this void for a real path forward relative to education funding, and how this state in the future, and I'm talking in the next 3, 4, 5, or 6 years, is going to fully fund K through 12 education. Has that been on your minds, Representative? I'll start with you.
Absolutely. For a lot of different reasons, but I think the economic benefits of really good education has been proven. And just on the simple part, if we can just make sure that our kids get out of high school, it saves taxpayers money, because of people that don't get out of high school tend to not contribute to the economy as much, may even end up in jail. And it's sort of so I think education is really important. And then the farther these kids go, the more they bring back as far as to the economy, I believe, with innovation as well as just well-paying jobs.
Do you see Wyoming making strides in solving that funding problem for education? How do you think that might occur?
I wish I knew that. I wish I had a better answer for that.
And you and everyone else, by the way.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. I know the speaker and a couple of the leadership representatives are working on it really hard. And it would be helpful if we could come up with some revenue. When I was in CERB before, we came up with helium. And helium was leaving the state without an ad valorem on it, and it brought in a couple $1 million for the county of Sublet, as well as $6 or $7 million a year for the state. And there's other things that I was thinking we should be looking at, and potentially it's lithium, but things like that that I don't think we're paying enough attention to.
Senator James, you're a fiscal conservative. We talked about that just a moment ago, but are there opportunities for Wyoming, or does Wyoming need to find some additional revenues, either in a modernized tax structure, that you hear that buzzword floating around, that you can support?
The way I look at it is, we shouldn't be spending money we don't have. If we're $300 million in deficit for the education, then we need to find places to cut the $300 million. We shouldn't be spending more than we have. I've always been a big fan of, with Wyoming and its population, we can't really support big corporations. And we have tons of industrial shovel-ready areas throughout Wyoming. So we need to start filling those with small to medium-sized businesses, start attracting those instead of the bigger corporations. Fill those up, kind of walk, or crawl, walk, run type scenario.
One issue that's been important to you is the Bitter Creek project in Rock Springs, to maybe make flooding a little bit less of an issue. What's the update there?
So we're still going to be going after the SLIP board for some funding for
the
that.
State Land and Investments Board, for those who aren't certain what that is.
That's correct. And I've also been utilizing other sources. I've contacted the Army Corps of Engineers to get that wheel rolling. I've contacted the Department of Homeland Security. They have a $3 million grant for water projects. I've been working with the Wyoming National Guard to utilize their engineering unit, which have heavy equipment operators, masons, electricians, plumbers. Utilize them to do the big time-consuming projects, give them the training necessary that they are needing for their particular job, and it'll also save Wyoming that project a ton of money. So it's kind of a win-win situation, and also the aspect of them serving their community, doing something that's going to benefit everyone.
Representative Roscoe, you sit on the Revenue Committee. I want to chat with you in the time that we have left just briefly about the revenue future of Wyoming. We've talked about it a little bit before. What's the best way for Wyoming to understand its revenue needs as its dependence on minerals, most people say, is waning?
I would say pay attention to world markets, and for one thing, because people keep hoping that some of these minerals we have are going to come back, and I think we may want them to come back for our revenue, but the world markets are telling us that they're not coming back, and so I think we have to look ahead to somewhat progressive sources of revenue. I think renewables is one. Another source of revenue, I think, is just paying attention to what we are getting at the moment. There's been sort of a move to cut some severance taxes on certain minerals, and
uranium is one.
Uranium is one. I don't think that's, and uranium is a complicated market. We're getting cheap uranium from Uzbekistan, but so that's another thing we ought to, maybe we should talk to the federal government about putting a tariff on that to protect our own uranium. But I don't think we should be cutting the severance tax on probably anything at the moment.
Senator James, you're a switchman on the railroad, as is Representative Blake. We got to meet him earlier in the show today. Now, I understand there's a little railroad history on this side of the table, too. Representative Roscoe, maybe perhaps from your younger days. Is that true?
They were my younger and somewhat foolish days. I was just traveling. I was going to a friend's place up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I hopped on a freight train from about Glacier National Park across Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. And at times I wasn't really sure what state I was in.
Or where the train was going.
Well, they didn't have as many signs as road signs. But after a while you get a sort of a sense of when a train gets into a yard, it goes back and forth. And I could feel it taking off and going the wrong way, even though I was just lying down and it was totally dark. And I figured I should get off. I'm not an experienced hobo. I was sort of learning as I went. And I threw my backpack off and I jumped. And I knew after I threw my pack I had to leave. And so I rolled down the bank. And the train finally went by, and the sun was just coming up, and I saw a couple silos, and it turned out I was in Minot, North Dakota.
Oh my goodness.
And it was really fun to have no idea really where you were for the moment.
Well, best wishes to you both. The session's, what, 3/4 of the way through? Still some road to travel here, some train track to travel on maybe, as the case may be. And we appreciate your time on Capital Outlook. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Speaking of time, we're going to talk to Representative Dan Larsen about his bill that may have Wyoming in a different time zone if it's successful. Stay with us. And as we conclude week 6 in Capital Outlook, it's my pleasure to be joined by Representative Dan Larsen from Park County. And we're going to figure out what time it might be a year from now.
Well, I'm hoping we do.
Representative Larsen is a sponsor of House Bill 14, the Mountain Daylight Time Zone Bill. And as I understand the bill, Representative, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would move Wyoming to the Central Time Zone. And then in the Central Time Zone, Wyoming would be on Standard Time year-round, effectively making Wyoming, as we think today, having daylight savings time year-round.
That is correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, and it's kind of confusing. But by federal law, if you're in your state as a whole is in one time zone, you can stay on standard if you just request it with the Secretary of Transportation.
Now,
and that's what Arizona does.
Yeah, and Hawaii too, I think.
That's correct.
And this bill has passed the House, it's passed the committee in the Senate, and now it's waiting for action by the entire Senate. We'll see what happens there. The question becomes why? What benefits would Wyoming derive from having daylight savings time year-round when surrounding states may not?
That is a tough one, and I brought the bill many years, and I think you realize that too. I brought it 4 years ago and have every time since. But mainly my concern is just changing the clock. It's hard on people. It's hard on, older people. It's hard on the younger people, especially in the schools. I know it affects them on their test scores and stuff, especially in the springtime. And that's my main concern, is quit changing the clock. I really would be okay either way, but being that we're on daylight standard or daylight savings most of the year, 8 months already, I just felt like another 4 months would be good.
Any concern that initially at least Colorado wouldn't be, Nebraska wouldn't be, Utah, those states right around us, and for us who live in Cheyenne, we would have to cross the border and figure out how to set our computer clocks back an hour and then forward an hour. Is there any confusion that you're worried about?
That has been a big issue in the last times I brought it, especially last year. And coming up with it this year, I put in there that 3 contiguous states also have to do the same. So we won't do anything really until we get 3 others to join us.
And the chance for that happening is?
Well, I'm hoping it'll happen. I've been in contact with some legislators, but then you get into the argument of if they want to stay standard or go to daylight all year, you know. So it's a tough battle, but hopefully they'll see us do it and then be encouraged.
So what you're saying is that we could not do this on our own?
Not the way the bill is written right now. Yeah, who knows? Maybe somebody will amend it on the other side. I worry that was a lot of the discussion is people like up toward where I live, up toward Billings and going to the doctor or to the airport, but I do use Cody Airport. Better make sure I say that.
Sure.
But the worry of knowing what time it is has been the discussion mostly, you know, like going to Salt Lake or Denver.
Well, I told some friends that I was having this discussion with, I was hoping my computer watch could figure all that out for me. I just want Alexa to still wake me up on time.
That's right.
In the morning. And then flip side of this, I think that, you know, things would be later in Wyoming than they would be in surrounding states. Those of us who like sports, for example, those would be an hour later.
That's what you were telling me, and I didn't think of that, but you're correct.
Was there any thought in your mind to maybe we should go on standard time year-round and go that hour earlier? Did that cross your mind?
It's crossed my mind, but I think a lot of people like that hour in the summer especially, you know, toward the evening. And they always say the golfers like it a bunch, but I think anybody does, you know, going fishing or boating or just being out in the park.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, barbecue.
Well, it's kind of 3/4 of the way there almost when you consider the way bills work in the Wyoming legislature. Any thoughts on whether or not this is going to make it to the finish line?
I think that last year the Senate actually got it to 3rd reading, and then they decided they didn't like it. But I think there's good chance, you know, putting the, I don't know if I should say the group hug mentality in there, I think makes people feel a little better.
Any thought on whether our chief executive likes the idea?
I think he does.
All right.
I think he does.
We'll watch this bill with bated breath here in the last couple weeks here of the legislature.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank
Representative
you.
Dan Larsen, thanks for joining us on Capital Outlook. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for the invitation.
Best wishes for the rest of the session.
All righty. Thank you.
And that's a wrap now for our 6th week of Capital Outlook. Lots has happened this week. A budget bill maybe has been agreed to. We're going to learn more about that in the days to come. And we look forward to also visiting with you, our viewers, in week 7, which will be next Friday here in Capital Outlook. Thank you for joining us and have a good evening.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.